This is Nick Cody from Green Eyed Records, and I'm delighted to be with Sylvie Simmons, currently in San Francisco. And I wanted to start off by asking you how you first got involved in the music business, and especially from the writing perspective.
Oh, well, I was obsessed with music as a kid, entirely obsessed. And I just figured that the only thing that I could do with my life, when I ticked every other possible job that I'd have to do off of the list as being impossible or not wanted, was to get into music. And initially I thought, well, maybe I'll be a singer-songwriter, purely on the grounds of having a guitar and being able to sing some Joni Mitchell songs. I completely froze up. And immediately my sensible brain said, well, you've got to be a writer and write about music. And I sent around a bunch of letters to the weekly music press. There were 4 magazines back when I started. This was in the mid-late 70s. There was Sounds, Enemy, Melody Maker, and Record. Yeah. And I think that none of them replied, like on the phone, and did that. And I felt a little bit kind of lost and bewildered. And then I met this photographer who was taking pictures of all the bands at the time, the pop bands at the time. And he suggested that I write some little articles to go along with pictures he was taking. So I got this immediate access into the kind of pop world. And then from there, flew very quickly from London over to LA in 1977, where my name was known by various press people, press officers and publicists that would set up interviews. And I just sort of segued immediately from talking to the Bay City Rollers and the like to, I think the first one I did was Steely Dan in the US.
Steely Dan, one of my all-time favorite bands.
And I loved them too, yeah, because it was almost like in the film Almost Famous, where you've got this kind of wide-eyed kid who's thrown into the whole kind of big, great sort of world of music and famous musicians. And it was exactly like that. I was put in the room with the 2 of them and with Donna Water, and they were being absolutely as corruptive towards me as they possibly could, but delightful and highly intelligent and smart and sarcastic and New Yorkers. And I loved their music. So I think that they decided on the grounds of my looking about 10 years old, they would give me a really good interview.
Wow. So you've written for like a number of different publications. I mean, some I'm very familiar with. Sounds, I grew up with Sounds. It was in England, it was Sounds, Melody Maker, and NME were the 3 key ones. But also you wrote for Cream and Kerrang, which I'm less familiar with. And then, of course, Mojo, which I have every copy ever since the very first one. What did you like? Who did you like working with the most, and how are these different in different ways? I mean, I appreciate that's a big, broad question.
It's a very broad question. It's like all of these magazines, or most of the magazines that I've written for, I've tended to always write for them. It's that sort of, it's like we were more than going steady. I was almost like a partnership with, this is a stupid way of putting it. I was on Sound for 7 years, and that was my magazine. And said, I've got this interview with Steely Dan. Do you want it? And they said no for whatever reason. And Sound said, send it over, we'll take a look at it. I love them. They let me do a column every week. And so I'd be writing tons and tons of articles. Somebody just posted a bunch online yesterday that interviews I was doing back in the late 70s. So I stuck with Sounds. But what happens is that other magazines in other countries then say, well, do you want to work for us or write for us? It was always freelance. Cream, I adored. They were probably the nearest thing in America to a kind of British style magazine, which has that slightly irreverent quality. It wasn't quite so sycophantic or pretentious. And so writing for them was an absolute dream. When I moved back to England in the 80s, sounds had a different, so that was why I left. Also, before that happened, Kerrang, at the time they used to have our pictures sometimes in the paper, had to be somebody else. And so I had a pseudonym for Kerrang in the beginning, Laura Canyon, on the grounds that I was living in Laura Canyon. And I think they gave me about 2 minutes to come up with a fake name. So that I was Laura Canyon. I had a blonde wig for the pictures of Laura Canyon in Kerrang. I'm actually now kind of gone back to being a sort of blondish, but I had black hairs when I was on Sounds. It was much punkier. So these were very different magazines to work for. And I also wrote a column for a German magazine and for a Japanese magazine, also, and interviews for them. So what it did for me really was I was able to have access pretty much to every kind of music. So if one magazine was going, say, through a metal stage, I'd be really happy to go up on the road with Black Sabbath or whatever. And then I could come back and talk to Michael Jackson or to Joni Mitchell. So it was lovely to be able to just do everything. I was looking, this little black book I've got, it's just one of those ones where you kind of add an extra bit of paper when you run out of a page. And I used to write down what article I did or what interview it was, the date I sent it, who it went, what magazine it went to. And if I got paid, that was the thing, a little tick at the end. I didn't put any details about, and staying up all night with parties and doing stuff with the columns, which was all the kind of the gossip and the parties, basically, the news.
Wow. So this was late 70s, I think you were saying?
Yeah, I moved out there in 1977. I remember I'd moved out to LA, and the first thing I wanted to do was not really look around LA, but go down to Mexico. I couldn't believe that Mexico was so near. You know, you just go down there. And I remember renting a car and driving back from Tijuana, which was insane at that time. And as I was sort of waiting in the queue of cars to, you know, be allowed back into America with passports and everything, there were people sort of just coming up like vendors selling stuff. They'd have all these plaster casts of things, and they had plaster casts of Elvis because he had just died. Probably had them somewhere in a back room waiting for this moment. But I remember buying a plaster Elvis, which I still proudly have on my mantelpiece, and thinking, oh, I would have really liked to have interviewed Elvis. My dad would have liked that.
Wow. So that's a big range. I mean, if you go Michael Jackson to Black Sabbath alone is like a huge range. What are some of your favorite interviews of the ones that you've done to date?
Oh, there's such a multitude of them. And I think that some of my favorites were when I had really good access to people. You know, when you first do interviews, quite often it will be on a press day. And let's say that the person is Elvis Costello. Elvis Costello is moved into a sort of a hotel room somewhere in LA when he's out doing his press. And then one interviewer is coming at one point, and then they finish, he gets 5 minutes for cussing about them all. And then the next one comes in and you get your 45 minutes, or if you're a bigger magazine, an hour, or if they like you, a whole lot of time. So there was this kind of thing where you didn't really get to right into the heart and soul of somebody as much as you'd really like to. Because my whole thing about music was that I loved music so much that I was totally obsessed with finding out about who made it. Where did it come from? You know, what is the sound of sound? What is this? What is it that makes you be so amazing that I spent every penny that I had as a youngster to buy your music? I didn't just want to have this is what's going on, you know, hey, this is it. Oh, my new album's, you know, development from the last, I've really evolved. The kind of stuff that they pull out at those So some of my favorite interviews, one was in 79 when I went on the road with Black Sabbath. You can only imagine what it was like being on the road with Black Sabbath, touring with them, traveling with them, staying up after the show and trying to do interviews with them. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to tell the whole story of that now or later, because maybe it will be a story on its own, but it was so interesting. Mm-hmm. So that was one of them. Another one was Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen, I'd loved his music since I was in my early teens, and I heard him on a compilation album, Rock Machine Turns You On. His voice came on and it almost like lifted me up out of my little bed. I was living with my mom and dad. And I was like, what the hell? This is important. This is special. So I'd interviewed him over the years, but I'd interviewed him by phone. And then one time, in 2001, we did an interview that lasted 3 days, talk about access. And I think at the end of it, I had that I came out of the place like pretty much any interviewer, male or female, who's been in the room with Leonard Cohen, where you're almost like blushing and smoking an imaginary cigarette. There's something so seductive about his attention and focus on you. But it was only really when I went and spent days doing the transcripts of all of these interviews that I realized that this was one of his tricks, in fact. I guess a lot of musicians have their ways of dealing with journalists and their prying questions. And his was to be so charming and to really read the person who is in the room with him and give them such good quotage that you realize that he's actually not answered the questions necessarily in the way that you would like. Other people like that are Tom Waits, a delightful person to interview. You could sit in the room with him for a year and not get bored. But the way that he hides the truth in his way of going off in these wild stories is quite, it's a wonderful, wonderful work. I think what I found overall from being a music journalist is that a lot of frontmen are very, very shy.
Yeah.
And they've had to hide that. It's really interesting to watch.
Well, you referenced Tom Waits. I mean, I remember seeing, for the first time ever, I saw Tom Waits on the Old Grey Whistle Test doing Small Change. And I remember thinking, who is this? And here we are 45 plus years later. I'm still listening to Tom Waits. Fascinated at times with certain albums, thinking, I'm not sure about this. But then all the best artists tend to provoke in that way. Neil Young, similarly, you'll have artists where you just go, whoa, what's happening here? But I think it's fantastic to have had access to people of that particular stature. And you mentioned obviously these different types of interviews. So what would be your sort of like top tips if you're somebody going to be interviewing an artist? What are the absolute, say, 3 top things you really should pay attention to?
Well, the first thing is that you need to do your research. In a way, you need to go in there kind of having a feeling of knowing the person a little bit. You know your stuff. You're not going to make that many mistakes. That means, and also it means if you have a limited time with that person, you don't have to waste that time on asking, what made you play the guitar, Eric Clapton? Or actually, I remember going to a press conference where one woman clearly, I know what newspaper she was from, but said, asked Eric Clapton what instrument he played. That was an eye-opener. But I think you have to go in with that. Clearly, if you're doing an interview, you're doing it for someone or something these days. You hardly can. In the past, you could almost walk up to a rock star in the 70s and say, hey, can I interview you? And nobody would really say, well, what for? But now you have to go through all of these different kind of levels of, the courtiers and everything. So, you're going to have to get what the magazine wants, but you're also going to try and get what you want and what you think that readers would want to know. There's this balance that you're trying to do all the time. So I think that was really the most important thing. I mean, I've ended up a lot of times interviewing people I don't like, or even whose music that I don't like, because I was a correspondent for a magazine and they would send you off to talk to some band or other. And you could go in there with or just track, or you could go in and think, well, this is music for a living, or she's doing music for a living. And however unpleasant they are to you at that time, occasionally you can put a little, I have been known to be kind of pretty evil when I've written those up, if they've been horrible, or if they've been more than horrible, some. You just think there is something about them that we have in common. We both love music.
And some of the, dare I say, some of the strangest or worst ones, because I guess there's going to be a spectrum of different interactions like everything in life. I think,
there's been some, I think probably my most famous, absolutely awful interview was with Lou Reed. Lou Reed, I think, made a sort of hobby almost of just really being rude to journalists. He hated them, absolutely hated them. And I was doing an interview with him for Mojo magazine. And at that time I was living back in England. I flew out to New York and the interview was going to be in his office. I think it was the only interview he was doing that day. And I remember my editor had to send off so many things about me and before I was allowed to talk to him. I mean, for example, I'd just written at that point a book on Serge Gainsbourg, and they sent us, I think they sent a copy of that book and like a couple of cover stories that I'd done for Mojo, something like that, to prove that I was worthy of being in the presence of Lou Reed. And he was so horrible that it made me laugh during the interview. Probably not the best reception. If I said one word of a question, I'd say, do you? And then he would go into attack mode and start yelling and screaming, like, you're going to say this. I said, well, may I add like 2 more words to this question? And so it continued. But it was a very, very, very strange as well that I hadn't gone into, but I hung in there. And at the end, I said, this is for our section called the Mojo interview, where it's just a little introduction to bring people into the room with you, and the rest is Q&A. And I said, I don't know about you, but I feel that maybe we could have done a better job. And would you like to finish it on the phone, or can I come back? I was like, no. And so that was what it was. And so it came out as it was. And I actually, I guess, didn't put in all of the rudeness, but it was so over the top. It was insane. I actually put that slightly, nicer version of it up on my website, because I really felt sad about it, because I loved Velvet Underground so much. And Lou just seemed to think that all journalists hated him. It was weird, and he never got the attention he deserved. I just say, don't be silly at one point. We all loved you for heaven's sake. It was definitely
Wow. And is there anybody that you have not interviewed yet, but you'd really like to interview, and for whatever reason you've not had access, or they've not been giving interviews?
There's just one, all by himself, Bob Dylan. Hope it happens one day. I really do. It came very close once for Mojo. We were going to do an interview with him. And, behind the scenes when these interviews are going on, there's always like a kind of negotiations going on between editors and PRs and everything. But it's going to be a cover. It's going to be X number of words or pages and everything. But somehow I think the demands that his publicists were making versus what Mojo was willing to do in this particular set of, we were only going to be allowed something, though I haven't met him personally, 20 minutes, kind of playing tricks. It just seemed that's going to be hard to do a cover story. That's my memory of why it didn't happen. But, I would have loved to sit in a room with him. But especially now, especially in that time since the Scorsese documentary, where I think all of us sat with our jaws falling to the ground, that here's Bob Dylan and he's telling the truth. He's speaking.
Yeah.
It would be like Tom Waits taking his hat off and putting on a suit, and dancing for us. It was such a strange phenomenon. And I've loved his book Chronicles, where he was being honest in that as well. And I think right now, yes, I would love to sit and have a cup of tea with Bob Dylan and talk about things.
Well, I for one would love to read about that. I grew up similarly with Dylan from age 13. I was listening to Dylan. I remember queuing all night in Portsmouth all night long, and on that night the Tubes of all people were playing the night. So somebody took over my queue space. I went in, saw the Tubes, then came back, and then slept in a sleeping bag for another 6 hours before I could get tickets to go and see Bob. That would have been, I think, Street Legal tour, and just stunning times in that respect.
Yeah, I think
you mentioned Leonard Cohen, and obviously you wrote the for as far as I'm concerned, a definitive book on him. How did the original introduction come about? Was it through a particular magazine, or
You mean, how did I first ever interview Leonard?
Yeah,
that must have been that I didn't even know it was coming up. It was a phone interview, so it was the first time I spoke to him. I think it was a Q&A to go with a review. I didn't get anything with him I didn't get commissioned by Sounds to do anything with him. There's various artists that are so kind of huge and so loved that the kind of lineup of the big queue of journalists of the magazine who want to get to him was very long. And he didn't even though he lived in LA, I didn't really sort of see much of him in LA when I was living out there. So it wasn't the fact that Sylvie's there, she should go and talk to him, which was quite often the case. I think a lot of the interviews I got was because the magazines obviously said, well, she's so, but how it went from there to the book was, I think I'd been thinking about doing a Leonard Cohen book ever since that very, very long interview that we did in 2001. It was just when he'd come down from the mountain. He'd been living up on Mount Baldy as a monk for 5.5 years. And he did the album 10 New Songs, which I love. And when I'd realized that kind of blown smoke, how wise, how good, he didn't really answer a lot of the questions. And I thought, I'm going to have to do something about this. And I kept thinking about doing a book, and then I kept putting it off because there was always other work, reviewing and interviewing and going here, there, and everywhere. And doing a book, it does take up an awful lot of your life. Really, really does. But I got in touch with him and said that I wanted to do a book on him. And he initially kind of gave a sort of I would guess a sort of benign tolerance, and then it went into support. Over time it was, he became supportive and made himself available for any interviews I wanted to do.
Well, I'm so glad you got to do it, because it just captured such a unique artist. I mean, there are artists like that. I think for me personally, Tom Waits is another one, which is just like from another planet. You just think, goodness, I don't know what to say. It's just quite extraordinary.
Truly are these one-offs. They're like a one-person genre, and they're always going off doing different things, complicating your life, like movies, and with Tom and with Leonard, books, poetry, prose, everything.
And And if again, if there was, I mean, I'll assume Dylan would be, if somebody said, any choice of anybody for a biography, it probably would be up there. But is there anybody else that you'd really like to write about, from a biographical point of view?
I have shelves of books on Bob Dylan. Like pretty much every aspect of Bob Dylan has been explored in book form. And I think to add to that list would be an insanity for me. Yes, there are some people. There's one person in particular that I am like discussing with myself whether I want to do it, because I know he does not want a book. So at least we know it's a man. So I would not get the kind of, benign tolerance or support that I got from Leonard. Support meaning merely that they don't stop people talking to you. One of the things about rock biographies, I'm sure that a lot of people who love rock magazines spend a lot of money buying rock biographies. And sometimes they think, well, I kind of knew that, or it's not telling me anything new. One of the reasons for that situation could be that they're just lazy writers. But I think a lot of it is because they're not getting access to the A-list of people they want to speak to, for the simple reason that it's not, the person who they're writing about doesn't want them to write it. So yes, there is one thing I'm secretly writing things on, but it's almost like a book for me. I'm not sure I'll even tell my agent about it until I'm kind of ready. It's one of those things where it's like, it is one of those big name acts, and it's.
Now I'm intrigued. We'll have to, it's like one of those things at the end of those old sitcoms will go, to be continued,
Oh, yeah. And it's being continued, it's making me think about all sorts of different things. It's good to get the brain working. So yes, it's going on. It's been going on in my head now for several months, but the person does not want a book and would not allow access to anyone. So it's
wow.
It's a little more of a spy venture.
Well, of course, as well as the biographies, is some of the compilations I have, which you dearly sent to me, the Neil Young compilation of articles, which is my next on the list. And I just started on Too Weird for Ziggy, which is, of course, fictional, So how did that actually come about? Because that's a little bit different to what you were doing previously.
Yeah, that was a book that just kind of popped out of nowhere, in a sense. As you know, that's untrue because it popped out of some. It was going out frequently to America and covering the LA scene. I'd moved back to London in '84, but I was spending like one day or 1 week every month pretty much out in LA, still doing stuff with the metal bands out there. Partly because when I'd been living in LA, I was the first one to write about these bands, and often before they even had a record deal, like Motley Crue, when I go to the gates of heaven before God and I say, well, I was the one who discovered Motley Crue, I'll probably be sent in the other direction immediately. But I'd go and see these bands, and not talking about Motley Crue in particular, but just a generality. There was so much going on around that scene that had gone so over the top that I just figured, my whole feeling was that celebrity corrupts and absolutely. That was all control, and all of these sort of surgically altered girls in jacuzzis everywhere. It was kind of a little bit obnoxious before Nirvana came along and sort of kicked them up behind a bit, and grunge came in as a big reaction against that kind of glam metal period. And so I started writing these short stories, and some of them were based on a kind of germ of truth, like a story I'd heard, but, it was off the record, or it was during a conversation that wasn't recorded, and it would have, it would have been unethical to put it into an article. So I'd take one of those sort of stories and just kind of riff with it, and finding out that I really have a kind of sick, dark mind deep inside. And so these stories just became these odd tales of musicians, some of them based on a true person. So that was interesting. And I think my favorite story of the Too Weird for Ziggy stories was one about this kind of rock star who I'd met in person, and he was just such a sexist pig anyway when I was talking to him. But in my story, I made him go on tour, and at some point in the middle of the tour, he woke up and he'd grown breasts. So it was this story of what happens when this kind of misogynistic guy suddenly is left with a nice pair of his own. And I just turned into a bit of it was kind of sad. It was a bittersweet story, that one. So yeah, I did that. It was really nice. It got great attention. It was like a bit of a cult book, and it came out on the William Burroughs old imprint. So I felt so pleased with that.
Wow. I mean, we come from kind of similar era from the 70s. So if you go back to sort of like 1970s and you fast forward 2022, sounds even surreal even saying that. What's the biggest change, or a couple of the biggest changes you've seen? Obviously, there was a time when we used to buy these big plastic discs. I remember going into Threshold Records in the UK, owned by the Moody Blues, and paying £2.15 for a big plastic disc and seeing all the old Hendrix albums out on track and things like that. And you fast forward to these days where it's digital files and completely different. But what in your experience is like the biggest changes, either from I'll just leave it. The biggest changes, I'll just leave it as general as that.
You mean as a music journalist?
Well, as a music journalist, or also sort of observations in terms of what it's like now for artists compared to what it was like back at a time when, it was very much more the traditional record model.
Between then and now, talking to somebody, the industry completely different. Even journalists were important. These magazines were coming out every week in the UK and actually talking about music, because you weren't listening to it that much on the radio. We got pirate radio, of course, those of us of a certain age, BBC, off and on, top of the pops. It was so much as almost like a culture, a cult culture, in a sense that you really, really, if you were obsessed with music, you wanted to know about it. You bought the magazines. You learned to kind of trust certain music writers. We all had our favorite music journalists in whatever magazine it was, and we believed them. We knew that they weren't just hating a band because it was the band you were meant to hate, or loving them because they're so awful that nobody else would love them. So back then there was a sort of something we were doing. Now, fast forward to this age in 2022, why would you want to ask a journalist what it sounds like? You just go and find it for free somewhere, And the word free is a whole different world. Back then, you needed to know whether this music was moving these people enough to write about it in a way, because you're going to spend your money on it. You had to pay a lot of money for an LP at that time as a kid. I know now they're $25, which is a fortune, but that's because people want to have this beautiful object. But we were doing a sort of function. We had our areas of music we loved and people trusted that. We were also important in a way to the music business, because it was a way of introducing new artists. But one of the most famous, I mentioned him before in this interview, is like Elvis Costello. Elvis Costello got a record deal in a way by getting on the cover of, I think it was Sounds. It wasn't me that wrote the piece. I did Motley Crue instead. But these people, journalists, would actually try and persuade somebody to go out and buy something. Now, as I say, a lot of the time here, it's just they're giving a sort of brief description. Nothing really, unless, in magazines like Mojo that still take their music very, very seriously, and Uncut in the UK that does this. What was all this about, really? And the other difference is that in 1977, when I started writing, pretty much writers were given we could write at great length about something, and editors didn't mind. My piece that I did with on Black Sabbath when I was on the road with them was like, it's the size of a book, and they ran it over 2 issues. It's like, we'll have first this week, come back next week for the, we've had the Aussie part, now we'll come back for the Tony Iommi part. You had that freedom. Reviews, they'd say, write about a page or so. Now everything has to be digital, because it's all digital, has been sort of slotted into a little 150-word thing that's on the page. And there are many times now when I'm very frustrated, right, you've given us small space. That's it. So that's changed very much. As far as for the artists, I don't know. It's they don't really give access so much to journalists as they used to. It's to say there was this kind of love-hate relationship. You'd hang out with them sometimes. One of the bad sides, maybe, or of the myth of music journalists is that we all thought we were rock gods. We didn't think it. We knew it. But no, we were used to kind of hang out with them and dress like them, and there was that sort of side of it. But then there was also the nerdy side of rock journalists, where it was the spotty boys with glasses who kind of write all of these things about great metal bands. So huge changes. For me personally, pretty much now I'm only ever sent music by stream.
Wow, really? So not sort of very few physical products?
Very few physical products. If I'm doing, say, an Americana column, which I started, I inaugurated in Mojo back in the 90s and still write. With that, sometimes they'll send a CD, which is really lovely because I just like the physical object. But I understand that, young people don't. They don't want to own, but they want to own everything. And the only way of owning everything is, in fact, owning nothing.
Well, I'm a massive physical product fan. Much as I like high resolution files, I like a nice box set with a booklet and a great commentary, and I love that.
Oh, yeah. Mike, I must pull these over for the visuals. How about this? I didn't mean to have these. I wasn't going to sit here for this. I can't even lift it. It's so heavy. Ugh.
Wow, look at that.
You got that on the screen? That's all heavy vinyl. Johnny Cash with that book that I wrote about with him, actually, for that book. And this is another great box set. Can you see that one?
Town Van Zandt.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's got this big picture book in it, and it's got the DVD, and it came out. So these are sort of things that they won't fit on any shelves. So they sit on the floor, which means they get played an awful lot.
Well, I personally, I love that. And of course, now you have at one end of the spectrum, you have like digital files and singles. On the other hand, you have artists releasing huge amounts of CDs. I think I forget who it was. There's one artist which was something like a 32 CD set. I'm thinking it's going to take you weeks to listen to it all. But I'm a big fan of that. What somebody who wrote in actually, somebody who one of the questions that came in was somebody was saying, like, as an artist, do you have any advice for how you get noticed? Because obviously there's a huge amount of noise. For somebody wanting to get any kind of recognition, is there any sort of suggestions that would be worth considering?
Well, I came out as a singer-songwriter very late along the line. A lot of people who are music journalists, the other great myth of music journalists is that we all want to be rock stars or musicians. There's a certain truth to that. And if nothing else, a lot of people I know who are rock writers are privately in their own little kind of rock bands, and some of them have released records, and some of them, like Chrissie Hynde, go on to be real stars, and quite rightly too. But when I came into it, it was 2014, I think my first album came out. It was after my Leonard Cohen book came out, and I'd been on the road sort of singing Leonard Cohen songs because crazily just felt that it was. So when I did that, I was persuaded to do an album. I was a bit shy about it, making my own songs public. But then once they were made public, my feeling was like, well, why is this so difficult to get any attention? And to answer that person's question, it is horribly hard. I don't really know what you do except try and develop a thick skin and still get it out there. I've noticed that if I put posts on Facebook that are about, if I put a picture of me up, whatever, or a picture of an album, it gets lots of likes. As soon as I say, hey, anybody fancy buying an album, suddenly you get hardly any likes at all. So I think that people are feeling a little bit overdosed at being advertised and sold to. I understand that. I feel the same way too. Every time you go online, you just constantly barraged by somebody selling you something. And I was just having a conversation with an artist, I won't name him, this morning. He'd sent me a stream advance of his album, just asked what I thought about it. And I'm friends with him, so I told him. And he was saying, like, oh, if you've got any ideas of how I can get it out there, it really is. It's the Wild West out there right now, but without everybody even shooting each other. They're just wandering around like zombies trying to get attention. I don't know. I mean, TikTok seems to get attention. I don't know. I don't want to go on TikTok. I think I
was talking earlier on to my producer. We just uploaded a single, the single about Scarlett Rivera. And in the on Kicker, who I use for distribution, there's a section there about TikTok. And Carl, who's been around forever, and he did all the engineering on people like The Wedding Present and lots of US bands. We were both going, I can't see us ever being on TikTok. Suddenly feel like really old guys. But there's a market, clearly. A different demographic for some of these things. Well,
exactly. That woman duo, Wet Leg from the Isle of Wight, been getting tons and tons of attentions because they got millions and millions and millions of likes on or posts or reposts on TikTok. I think if this person who's a musician really likes social media, with me, I remember getting upset when MTV started and everybody was like put on there on the grounds of having a video and looking cute. It didn't really seem to be what rock was about. Though, having said that, I loved the Beatles when I was a little girl, and it was probably because they were cute. So if this friend of yours is good with that, I would say making interesting videos, because visuals are now important.
Yeah.
Whereas to me, an album sleeve and the lyrics that being written on them, which of course you don't get when you're streaming videos. When you're streaming albums.
And finally, I'd like to say the biggest myth about being a rock journalist, what would that be?
Well, as in all mythology, there's all sorts of different archetypes in there, so we'd have to go into a few of them. I think one of the myths is that all rock journalists are frustrated wannabe rock stars, and there is a certain truth to that. Certainly that sort of the early great rock journalists, like late great Lester Bangs, was in a punk band, as was Richard Meltzer and artist. So that's part of it. Another myth is that rock journalists resent bands. They don't like that they're big and famous, and so they kind of build you up just to knock you down. I don't think that's true. I've been accused of doing that by one band that I really loved, an Americana band. Gave them as much publicity as I possibly could. And the one time they put out a bad album, I had to say it was not really as good. And I was confronted by one of the singer in the band on a street corner in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest, where he tore me a new one. It was quite funny because this guy was about 10 foot tall and I'm 5'2". So it was a bit sort of like this mighty person smiting tiny rock journalists. There should have been photos. There should have been a scandal. So that's one of them. The myth that of, being kind of some innocent kid corrupted by fame. I had that experience in a way, that bands were definitely trying to do that, but didn't succeed in my case. Are there any other myths you can think of being a rock journalist? And I'll apply an answer if I can.
I always love to think of the Cameron Crowe Almost Famous movie. I just thought it was just so nicely done, the whole innocence that from beginning to end and the journey of that. But I've massively enjoyed your articles, like, for as long as I can remember. I mean, it's just like, there's got to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, you know, and I've always found it just really intelligent writing and really interesting writing as well. I've also enjoyed your music, because what I didn't realize was that we both have a big love of the ukulele, which at this point many people will be going, what? Let me tell you, the ukulele is a super cool instrument and great for writing, you know.
Lennon's first instrument, Leonard Cohen's first instrument, yeah. George Harrison. I mean, all these people who loved ukes. I can understand in a way why the uke got a bad reputation, because it did bring out some cheesy music and stringed instrument that just makes this beautiful, intimate sound. I think is wonderful. I had a big just sort of sense of prejudice against it. But when I moved out to San Francisco, I wasn't planning to stay quite as long as I have. And so I left all my instruments in storage in England, my guitar and my piano. And I was dating this guy who came over with a uke, and I kind of almost put me off him. And I saw him with his uke. This is not very good. But he left his uke with me overnight one time, and I sort of worked it all out. And not that difficult if you play guitar. It's just that you're starting with a high note, which is strange, and it's 5 semitones different. But I kind of fell in love with this little thing. Just not so much the boyfriend, more with the uke. And it became a very kind of trusted companion. It's very much easier to carry than a guitar. You used to think you're a musician. If they're with a piano, then I'd like them because they're so strong. If it was with a uke, there's usually a sort of little bag that makes it look like a tennis racket.
Yeah.
So you kind of don't. It has no pretensions. It's the most unpretentious, modest instrument that you can really just hold close and express some really lovely things through. But I want to go back to what you were saying about Cameron Crowe and the Almost Famous. That really was one of the myths that I really loved about that you could meet these people. You know, here you are, just an average person. You've decided you like music. You've managed to persuade a magazine that you're writing about it is worth printing. And then you actually meet these people and you find out they're, just human beings. They're just people that sometimes are awful, sometimes are nice, but they're in this interesting world. And it's just so, the life that you get as a music journalist, or did back then, you don't get it at all now, it's completely gone, was you did kind of live like a rock star, in that you got, pretty much free entry to any shop. You'd get free entry into any nightclub or venue that you wanted to go to. You were on all the lists. In fact, when I was in LA, wasn't just only on the list for all of the clubs. They gave me a tab to get free drinks. And so, the truth of rock journalism is you don't make any money. I mean, even back then, it was hardly what you could live on. But you got all your food groups for free, because it's Kahlua, cream, you got dairy, free peanuts. It was wonderful. You got all your food, all your entertainment. You got all these albums coming every day in the post, LPs, with some poor long-suffering postman trying to get them up into your flat, which will be on the cheap top floor studio flat. So you got that. You got to go to where you wanted to go to. And you lived this kind of dual life, because you were living at home in just like normalness, on low scale of income normalness, but then you'd get sent first class to go and fly to LA, and you'd be put in the fanciest hotels. And it was this wonderful double life that you were able to lead, which was, that was my rock star life. And this is me going down to the shop with my CDs or LPs I don't want to sell to be able to make enough money to pay the rent. So this was life as a music journalist, and just the delight of hearing all this music before anybody else did, you know. If a new album came out by somebody that, whoa, and it was wonderful. And you just got these adventures that you would never get from, you know, working in a record shop, for example. You know, you'd be sort of you're going to a rock festival and one band says, hey, do you want to jump in the helicopter? I think so, okay. And then when you're in the helicopter, they're like Coke on a tray. It's like, no, thank you, I'm a bit scared right now that we might crash. So these kind of things that were going on in Almost Famous went on in our lives. And mostly it was just that daily injection of new music and going to meet somebody who out. Like the other thing as well about it is that if you're in the business for that long, as I have been, and a lot of people have been, I think I know people who've been a writer longer than I ship with bands. It's not like you're friends of the stars, you know, they're not necessarily inviting you over for, you know, Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. But as you get to know them and you get to see them once a year or once every year and a half when an album comes out, it's a really good feeling. It's a really good feeling to say, just be running into Robert Plant or somebody like that, who is probably one of the nicest human beings amongst the rock stars that you could imagine, just a regular, really good guy, and who still loves music and still experiments in music, does things that scare him, which is always good. You kind of, you sort of like almost like saying hello first, how are you doing, what are you up to, before you even get into the kind of the sort of battle which sometimes music journalism is, because they want to say one thing, you want to find out other things that maybe they don't necessarily want to talk about, and then somehow you get this material from which you can write something.
Wow. Well, just delightful talking to you. I mean, and absolutely. I mean, we could probably do 3 days, you know, but I'm not sure Zoom would hold up. But it's absolutely great talking to you. If people want to find out about your writing and also your music, what's the best point of contact for them to go to?
The best place right now would be sylviesimmons.com. That has pretty much everything up on there. But with the music, it's probably Bandcamp will be the best place to find it all and listen to it, because sometimes if you go to the label, they'll only let you have a certain amount of minutes of the music. But most of the stuff would be there. I mean, one thing I could talk about is like the frustration of a music journalist as well, when you do find an artist that's really good, but however much you write about them doesn't work out. I'm thinking other of kind of really awful interviews were kind of with, actually one with Frank Zappa, but then it turned into a good one in the end, because people would go like, what the hell was he like? So, I mean, if you want to do a kind of, it's like questions from the readers or the viewers said this, you know, and I can answer something like some of those if you'd like.
Yeah, I think I've got a lot of stuff now. I'd like to come back and do some more things with you. I'd like to sort of like let it percolate a little bit, because there's so much we can talk about. I mean, honestly, I could sort of sit here for 2 hours just on Tom Waits alone. You know, I got more Tom Waits albums than any other artist. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like shelves and shelves and shelves of Tom Waits bootlegs, Tom Waits live stuff.
I should be hitting you up for information on that then. When I interviewed him the last time, it was in person again out in LA, he gave me some tomatoes. It was so sweet. He'd grown some homegrown tomatoes and he bought this, and he was just really like, I don't usually give journalists tomatoes. Here, I grew them. It was just so nice. It was just really, really enjoyed talking to him.
Well, things I love about Tom Waits, I mean, I grew up with Zappa as well, was that Neil Young would be definitely. They were very much primarily, from my point of view, doing their own thing. and had an attitude, well, if people like it, that's great. And if they don't like it, well, they don't like it. So
Right. That's exactly right. You've got them totally into the, as I call it, the awkward bastard category, who are always the best. I interviewed Neil Young so many times, I mean, just countless times. And you just never knew what Neil you were going to get. You're going to get happy Neil, or if you're going to get grumpy Neil, or if you're going to get angry about something or other. It was always such an eye-opener talking to Neil Young. I don't regret any of those. I think actually it was only one I got a bit mad with him about, but it was when he was touring in the US with Bert Jansch opening for him. And Neil adored Bert Jansch, absolutely adored him. And Bert was one of the sweetest guys in the business, just so modest, so amazing. And I went backstage at one of those shows, and I'd arranged in advance with his now late manager, Neil's late manager, Elliot Roberts, to talk to Neil about Bert, just to say a few things about him for Mojo, for this review. And Neil was just being so cantankerous. It was ridiculous. I think that Elliot, the manager, had to kind of come in and say, it's just a few questions, Neil, it's no problem. But he could be very, very difficult. But that was what made him so great. He wasn't meant to be there shaking hands like a politician and kissing babies. He was there to do what he wanted to do, whoever he wanted to do it with, whenever he wanted to do it. That was his rule. And that's what's made the incredible body of work.
Well, I loved it when he brought out Harvest after the gold rush. The record company must have thought, this is fantastic. And then time fades away and you just go, what is this? And of course, my favorite, the Ditch trilogy, which I know we've talked about sort of on the beach. Tonight's the Night. I mean, that would be 74, 75. I just love that period.
Yeah, they're all down here in the Y section of LPs. But yes, I loved that era too. That was my favorite era, I have to say. I adored it. But yeah, but he's still doing stuff. It wasn't that long ago since I spoke to him on Zoom from Mojo, and it's delightful that he's just still so into the music. He just does it, puts it out. If you don't like it, tough. He's moving on. Just doesn't matter to him. See, Frank Zappa, and I interviewed him. That was very early in my career. It was like probably late 77 or 78. And I hadn't at that time got the chops really for dealing with tough people. I mean, I'd interviewed people like Steely Dan and Bruce Springsteen, but most of them were really nice to me. I think because there weren't that many women journalists, it was quite a novelty to see this one that probably looked like a 10-year-old in there, but with dyed black hair. All of these questions and seemingly knowing their music by heart, which I did. But I was interviewing Zappa, and he was just being so rude to me and just so horrible. And I kind of actually said something. I think it was something quite childish. It was like, why are you being so unpleasant? And he said, I hate the English. And I said, oh, what did we do? And he said, I hate them. I hate music journalists. I hate the English. I think he was also recording me as I was recording him. It was very weird. And so I think it was back from when he was pulled off stage at the Finsbury Park Astoria and got, by an English person. And I just carried on. I carried on asking questions just on the grounds that eventually I'd get enough answers for a piece, because I had to write the piece. That's the other thing. But research, if they're difficult, just keep going. Just keep asking questions. Out the window, you're still in there. You've still got hope. You could still get answers. And if they say horrible things in their answers, you can have a really interesting interview. But then later, I think that I got a call from the record company, PR, and she said, Frank said, do you want to do the interview again? And if so, I could go to his house in Laurel Canyon. At that time, I wasn't living in Laurel Canyon, but it was one of the reasons I think I decided to move there eventually. And yes, so I went to see him, and it was really interesting. He was working in his studio at home. I got to meet the kids, got to meet the wife. And I remember, I think it was Dweezil had come in, and he was telling me that Dweezil was in some sports team or something. He said, probably better being a musician, but either way, you'll get a blowjob. It was so funny. And he was just telling me all these experiments he was doing with music and how different notes would, make different physical body sensations in you. Like, what is it like? What is it like make you want to use the bathroom or something? It was just so fascinating. And he couldn't be nicer. And I think that was his way of sort of almost like apologizing for being difficult and making up for it. Something that I'd wanted Louis to kind of do, I guess, but that didn't happen. So yeah.
And Springsteen, what period was Springsteen?
What period? I can't remember, but it was certainly about 78, that kind of era, 1978, whatever came out then, 77, 78. And he was just delightful. He was so nice and so Springsteenian. And he just seemed a very regular guy. Came across that way.
Maybe The River around that time, I think.
I'm not going to get it wrong, so I don't want to have to go on. Springsteen is up there. And I'll have to look and see what one that is.
Wow, I'd love to have been.
So he was really nice. He was giving lots. I just remember how he looked and how he his body language. He was not very good at staying still, and he would like sit back on the chair, kept moving around, and he had this white T-shirt and he had his packet of cigarettes up the T-shirt. It was very much straight out of a kind of New York movie look, but he'd laugh a lot. He was very cool.